I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
To try and channel it for good.
Deny what they think is false, argue what they think is false. Free and uncorrupted communication.
I'd like to introduce our moderator, who is the Associate Director of the Center for Film, Television, and Media, Miriam Metzger. She's also a colleague of mine in the Department of Communication. She's interested in the social uses and effects of both traditional and newer computer-based media forms. She's actually really very appropriate to be involved in this because she's done a lot of research in traditional mass media and also research in the web. So she studies primarily issues of credibility of information in the new media environment, again, very relevant topic, problems of online piracy and security, which is certainly related, and the impact of news and political communication on public opinion, which, as you saw, is both a traditional newspaper as well as blog issue, and the theoretical and regulatory changes brought about the development of new media technologies. So there's almost nothing that we've talked about today that she isn't interested in doing work in. So Miriam, if you'll start a session off.
Thank you. Because today's events, and in fact all year long, the series of events we have intersect so well with all of my interests, I'm especially pleased to be involved in a formal way today. It is my job to introduce our last panel discussion here, which is entitled Ethics, Research, and Regulation. And we have two presenters. We have Professor Ken Harwood with us and Professor Philip Napoli. I'm going to just do a quick introduction of, Ken's going to be speaking first, so I'll start with Ken. Ken is an adjunct professor in the Department of Communication here at UC Santa Barbara. He comes to us from the University of Houston, where he finished out his career and, in fact, served on the faculty of a few other very prestigious universities around the U.S. during his career. Professor Harwood writes widely on media economics, media ethics, and media history, so all topics extremely relevant for today's discussion. In fact, I recently found out that he is one of our field's most prolific scholars. The number of articles that he produced in U.S. scholarly journals was in the highest 3% of articles by all authors at the time of his retirement, which I personally find very impressive. That is only part of his contribution to the field of communication, but significantly, Ken was also the president of the International Communication Association, the Broadcast Education Association, which, for those of you who don't know, is sort of the educational arm of the NAB, the National Association of Broadcasters, and he's still very active with that group as well. And director, he served as director of the National Association of Broadcasters as well. Interestingly, he is not only a scholar, theoretician, and thinker on these issues, he was a broadcaster himself and served as general manager of radio station WRTI in Philadelphia and KUSC here in Southern California down in Los Angeles. So please help me welcome Ken Harwood. He's going to be talking about model media firms, and one of the surprises, we were talking about surprises in the last session, one of the surprises that I've experienced today is a lot of what people have been saying has been a lot more optimistic about this issue of media consolidation than I thought, and so I think that's probably going to be the case with this talk on model media firms as well. So please help me welcome Professor Ken Harwood.
Thank you, Miriam, and I'll just have to adjust this to my magnificent height here for a moment and ask if you would please to give me 2 minutes warning after about 13 minutes from now. Okay, I'll do about 15 if that's adequate, and I hope it will be. And I hope you will permit me to adjust to the temperature by removing my jacket. The main question to which I hope to turn attention is probably something like, to what shall media firms aspire? What should they hope to be? And in that line, one would look, I suppose, early for models of comparison. To what should a media firm, meaning a firm that does media, one medium or more, with what should it compare itself? We ask media firms to behave ethically as they go about their work, and it would be nice to have some sort of model with which to compare them, and that is what I hope to offer in a few minutes, and to sketch a few specifications for such a firm and some modest sample operational transformations of them from theory to practice, and maybe a few implications too for dereg and consolidation and globalization of model firms. To begin, the outlook I offer is one of the importance of the individual, and the individual being a chief end of whatever we do. Sometimes a means, but always an end. It's for individuals that I do this. And that is the view I offer. And of course, I'm talking about the Western view of that, and within that, how we might and do look at individuals in the United States. And by a firm, I mean simply the ordinary economic definition of a firm, an organization that is an assurer of an economic good or service, that is, undertakes to provide it and tries to stand by it. So, behavioral theories of the firm generally are of two kinds. One kind seeks to describe and predict behavior, and often with the help of quantification. Another seeks to specify ideal behavior of a firm, or at least a preferred behavior. The smallest firms tend to put ownership and management in one person or a few persons, and the larger ones often put ownership separate from management. Owners often seek maximal returns to the risks for their financial investments in a firm. We heard that discussed earlier. While managers and non-supervisory employees often seek maximal compensation, either money or other, for the risks of their work. And we heard that discussed, if not directly, indirectly. Owners or employees often adapt to the wants and needs of customers, suppliers, creditors, neighboring publics, distant publics, allied firms, states, and others. Adapting is usually in the hope of continued returns or larger returns to ownership. And real firms, of course, differ widely in the priorities each places upon internal and external constituents. Rather than pursue further definition and theoretical material at this time, because the time is limited, let me turn to media firms in particular. A media firm is the same as any other firm in most ways. A media firm differs from other firms, in this country at least, and in some others, in giving special attention to other resources to broaden and special attention and other resources to broadening the competition of ideas. a la First Amendment, and so on. So what, may we say, a just media firm is, because it is the just firm that I offer as a model. A just media firm is fair to its internal constituents, including its owners, managers, and non-supervisory employees, and it includes compensation and other conditions of work. A just media firm is fair to its external constituents, including customers, audiences, creditors, suppliers, near neighbors, distant neighbors, and states. Fairness includes aims and behaviors fostering satisfactory conditions for all of those constituencies, not necessarily in equal kind or measure, but to the satisfaction in general of all of them, knowing that perfect satisfaction probably is beyond the realm of reality. Optimization of the firm often is the aim of such a media firm, but ideally a just media firm optimizes both return to the firm and the satisfaction of its constituents. In practice, each constituent might have less than a complete array of satisfactions, and yet the array as a whole is satisfactory, at least in part, if not entirely. An ideal array of satisfactions, of course, would be full and complete. Comparing actual media firms with ideally just firms might offer some ways to improve media firms. I'm now skipping a fair amount in the prepared text to talk a little about local scale and scope, because localism is one of my concerns, my chief concerns. And by localism, I mean the adaptation of the media content, media performance, to local circumstances for local audiences. Local scale and scope, and those are both technical economic terms, bring to the fore some essentials of all firms and of media firms especially. Local scale tends to rise and fall with local population and depopulation of places. An example might be that a small place has perhaps one or two small retail establishments, while a large place has many shops, small and large. A very small place has no shop. It is too small to support one. Local scope refers to several different products being produced by the same plant. A long-time example in local print media is the production of local billheads, handbills, and the like by a newspaper print shop. A local radio station can and often does produce and market compact discs of local musicians fairly easily and cheaply. Firms in general and media firms tend to continue longer through economies of scale and scope than without such economies. Local media firms, too, follow a pattern of rising and falling with population and depopulation. Some places are too small to sustain one local medium, although such places are served by media from larger places. Media from a large place tend to offer little or no content about the very small place. And here let me just add that the reason I am particularly concerned about small places is that I believe that a test, not the only, a test of a society is what it does for its least advantaged members, Few places are for long stable in population. Most rise and fall with local opportunities for employment. Loss of local media to media services in larger places tend to occur when local employment falls and depopulation follows. Profit-seeking unlicensed media, such as local newspapers, tend to disappear earlier than local media, such as radio broadcasting stations. A local cable system goes dark when population density in an area falls below an economic minimum, typically taking with it one or more local community channels. Satellite delivery is yet to be discovered as a way of serving local audiences. A local cinema often goes dark before the sole radio station departs. Lest depopulation be taken as unworthy of attention, a recent study found one in 4 of 3,141 rural counties, that's the count of counties, 3,141 rural counties in the United States to be depopulating, 1 in 4. And 232 of those counties to be depopulating rapidly. What is happening to those folks? They're becoming more urbanized as the need for people in rural occupations declines, in lumbering, in farming, in mining, and so on. More generally, the demise of locally owned and operated media because of overinvestment sometimes can be stemmed by consolidating instead of closing. For consolidation brings economies of scale and scope to continue some local media where there would be silence otherwise. A just media firm seeks to disseminate diverse content where there would be none otherwise. What remain, if local media remain at all, are non-commercial, often part-time volunteer-staffed media. These include low-power television, low-power radio, community newsletters, volunteer film and video making, and local internet and worldwide web services in text, audio, still photography, and video. Little noticed by many is the media organization of probable first and last resort in many communities. Often, a library is in place before a local newspaper or a local radio station. A public library usually offers newspapers, magazines, books, audio and videotape, discs, and connection to the net and the web. It may be seen as a public firm with all the responsibilities that go with being a media firm. When depopulation requires a public library to close, the remaining audiences might be served by a traveling public library, or people might go to another place for library services. Now just a word, 2 minutes. That's what I'll take. Thanks. A look at a model media firm. To build a model media firm seems somewhat akin to building a model house. One is aware that other models could be on offer and that structures stemming from a model might differ from each other in their details. The proposed model media firm is offered on the principle of taking individuals to be worthy ends and not merely means. A moral condition of this model media firm is to be just, when that means to be fair, and to be fair means to be even-handed and more than self-serving. The model media firm has a special obligation to offer diverse ideas when it competes with no other firm, a few others, or many others. Any media firm, whether in the private sector of the economy or the public sector, may choose to compare itself with such a model and to draw closer to the model or not. Some social regulators of media read things like critics, okay, social critics. Some social regulators of the media, or some regulators who are official regulators, governmental ones, if you will, might choose to forward the ethical principle, the moral condition, and the special obligation in this model. How do we operationalize this? To operationalize ethics, morals, and special obligations, such as these, one might turn to leaders of media firms as the responsible officers for transforming theory to practice by developing the internal cultures of their organizations through encouraging just actions. Social regulators and official regulators might be called to be responsible for similar transformations. Official regulators, in addition, might be called to favor jurisprudential equity, as contrasted with law or common law, in which fairness prevails. I would say, if I had time, a few words on deregulation, consolidation, and globalization, but that is the heart of what I wish to offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Our next presenter comes to us from Fordham University. It's Professor Philip Napoli. Professor Napoli is the director of the Donald McGannon Communication Research Center and professor of communications and media management in the Graduate School of Business at Fordham. Impressive titles for such a, I'll say young scholar, but I don't mean that in any sort of negative sense. Professor Napoli has written on media economics, media concentration, and communication policy, so you can definitely see his intimate connection with all of the issues that we're speaking about today. He has authored over 34 chapters and articles, and he has written now 3 books. One is Audience Economics, Media Institutions and the Audience Marketplace. This is published by Columbia University Press, and I understand it won the Picard Award for Best Book in Media Management and Economics. Again, another impressive accolade. He also has a book that's forthcoming titled Media Diversity and Localism, Meaning and Metrics. And this is exactly on our topic, and I encourage all of you who are interested in this issue to look out for this as it comes out. This stemmed from an earlier group that he put together, similar to our group today, in which he got a number of people interested in this issue, scholars and policymakers and media economists and a bunch of other folks together to discuss these very issues that we're dealing with in our series and here today. He has also been called upon by Congress to testify on the issue of media ownership and has gone several times before the FCC on media policy issues, this one included. So please help me welcome such a prominent and expert commentator on these exact issues that we're dealing with, media consolidation, Dr. Philip Napoli.
When you go last at one of these day-long conferences, you better be interesting or brief, and I'll shoot for both. See how I do. Okay. I think actually it's going to sort of take this issue sort of at the end back to where we started today, which is with a real focus on some research issues. But in my case, I'm going to really focus on some of the things that we don't know and perhaps we need to know. And in that regard, I'm really going to focus on the process of media policy analysis, how that process has changed, how the informational needs and the questions being asked seem to be changing, broadening, and then what is the kind of inputs that need to get put into the process that perhaps weren't being asked of us as scholars in years past. There was always that famous quote from FCC Chairman during the Reagan administration, Mark Fowler, about television being a toaster with pictures, and that being sort of a mindset that guided policymaking and policy analysis in years past. That's not the case anymore. There's widespread recognition now across all sectors that really addressing an issue, particularly an issue such as the ownership issue, requires attention to a wide range of issues and a wide range of analytical perspectives, and not a strictly economic lens, one that would reflect sort of treating the media as an industry like any other. So that's going to be the point of focus what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm particularly going to focus on the issue of diversity and how this process of trying to form effective ownership policy is trying to incorporate the issue of diversity in a meaningful way. But to reflect this sort of what I call a broadening analytical perspective. Here's a quote from a couple of Justice Department antitrust attorneys, which I think reflects this pretty well. The idea that the antitrust analysis of a media merger should be expanded to include its impact on the marketplace of ideas. Antitrust enforcers can elect to ignore the marketplace of ideas in their analysis of media mergers, and in the past that was sort of what they thought really their mandate was that narrow. But as it says here, we believe that this is a narrow approach to media mergers is incorrect, or at least incomplete. Similarly, we could look to the FCC's much scrutinized 2003 media ownership report order, where they have said they identified diversity, competition, and localism as longstanding policy goal. Should be an S there, I would think. That will continue to be core agency objectives in this area. And so, like I said, it's the issue of diversity has been an interesting one, because from a policy analysis standpoint, there's been this effort to bring some of the rigor to the analysis of diversity concerns that has been traditionally been brought to bear on competition analysis. And Ellie touched on this real brief, but didn't have time to get much into it, which is, I don't know how many of you are very familiar with the diversity index that the FCC created in its process of doing its media ownership review, but it was a very interesting effort that they undertook, which was to essentially take the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which was the sum of the square of the market shares of each firm in a market, and then to essentially weight it in a way that accounted for the extent to which citizens rely on different media technologies for news and information. So if you were a television station, you were accorded a different weight in the extent to which you were a contributor to diversity than you received if you were a radio station or a newspaper. And there were some controversial inclusions and exclusions. Cable was excluded. I believe the internet was included, but then the Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit disagreed with some of that. But an interesting process, and reflected in all of it was this notion of some mechanism for getting at what the FCC called the diversity importance of different information sources, and that this would then stand alongside the traditional HHI as a measure of analyzing the level of diversity in our marketplace of ideas, and thereby, giving us a set of indicators that can allow for both the traditional economic analysis and this more marketplace of ideas focused type of analysis. What was interesting about it, and that's and that was something that it was, in some ways this was really inevitable, was the extent to which the court was unhappy with the diversity index, because one thing that people forget about the HHI was it didn't just spring out of thin air. 1800 means something only because there were years of trying to associate a meaning with a particular score. So we have reason to believe that when an HHI is 1800, that we think firms are going to behave a certain way. What was fascinating about the FCC's diversity index was it was created and applied all at the same time. At a phenomenally rapid rate at which apparently this thing was deemed acceptable to, and that the numbers associated with it were deemed to mean something. So we're in a case, not surprising, that it's sort of a back to the drawing board type of situation on this issue. And from that perspective, what I've been doing as of late is to try to look at both the court's decision and the FCC's decision to extract from how this notion of diversity of importance is being conceptualized the kinds of research questions and the kind of research areas that could potentially contribute to a more robust take on this. And in that regard, this takes me to this basic question, obviously. And wait a minute, there we go. So this is the central analytical question that I've been thinking about as of late. What constitutes the importance or impact of different media from a diversity standpoint? This is what, in theory, the FCC is seeking, and what I would, my goal today is to outline some of the non-traditional, essentially, lines of inquiry and areas of research that might be able to inform this effort. I'll give them a quick overview, and then we'll talk about each of them in some detail. One obvious one that's always been talked about quite a bit is the question of content. Where is the relationship between ownership and content strongest? Might that be a factor that comes to bear on this weighting different sources differently? Should the provision of news and public affairs be at the core of how we weight different media sources differently from a diversity standpoint? And again, all this really pulls from existing decision-making related to this issue, so I'm just trying to pull it all together, really. the potential audience. Do we factor in the extent to which a source may be able to reach citizens? Or do we go even more specific, as the Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit seemed to want, which was get into the question of how many citizens does a source actually reach? Okay, and introduce that into the calculus of determining the diversity importance of sources in a particular market. Do we go to and address the reasons for usage of different information sources? That is, to what extent is one technology or one information source relied on for entertainment versus information, et cetera? And do we factor that into how we calibrate a revised approach to this question? Or do we get into, and this again pulls really from the language that the Commission used in their decision, do we actually get into effects? To what extent are citizens affected differently by different sources of information, or different, or different technologies produce different effects when they are, when information is consumed through them? Or even, do we actually need to consider effects on other media? To what extent do some sources affect other sources of information? And there is this process by which there's almost a chain reaction in the media realm, and that we consider the true origins of particular pieces of information. So what I want to do in the time that I've got is just to run through these in a little detail, to give you a sense of not only the types of questions that seem to me relevant, but just a sense of some of the information that's out there that could potentially be brought to bear on these issues. First, on the content front, and this comes directly from what the FCC said, news and public affairs programming is the clearest example of programming that can provide viewpoint diversity. Okay, if we take that and run with it, then do we ask ourselves these kinds of questions. Should a source's contribution to viewpoint diversity be a function of the extent to which the source provides news and public affairs? We have seen, we at the McGannon Center have done some work in this area where we examine different information sources, and to what extent, for example, do television stations in a market differ in the extent to which they provide news and public affairs, maybe in some cases providing none. Should that station count from a diversity standpoint to the same extent as a station that provides a lot of news and public affairs? These are just the kinds of questions that are now just out there that need to be clarified and answered, I think. Should the, even, and that gets to the other issue, should the measurement of such program provision even be part of measuring viewpoint diversity? That's sort of a controversial issue because the FCC has traditionally shied away from wanting to get too deeply involved in the content issue. But again, if you look in detail at their decision making over the years, they seem a bit schizophrenic on that front. The potential actual audience reach issue, I think, is an interesting one because the FCC's diversity index, as they described it, as they said, we premise our analysis on people's actual usage patterns across media today. So this opened to me a very interesting can of worms with this idea that usage would get factored into the assessment of how diverse a market is to an extent that was really unprecedented. And I thought that was very interesting. Particularly from the extent to which it opens so many fascinating cans of worms and makes potentially so many different areas of research relevant to going forward on this. Here again, the question is it appropriate to consider this type of issue? I think that's a very interesting question. And if we do, what level of analysis do we employ? The FCC treated every television station the same, and then every radio station the same, and the famous, contradictions that folks who were not happy with this produced were, for example, a little college television station in the New York market was weighted more heavily than the New York Times. And was there logic to that? The court didn't think so. So do we take it to the next level and actually start weighting individual outlets according to their potential or actual audience reach, and create a recalibrated index in that way? What this raises, though, is an interesting question. I take this from a paper by Bruce Owen, where he asked that question about how do we disentangle success from access? That is, do you have a large audience because you're just doing a good job, or is there something structurally that's contributing to the differentials that we see in audience reach of different sources? So this becomes thorny, and the interaction of distribution and marketing issues and other factors obviously come to play in that. How am I doing? I'm doing all right. Then we get to, like I said, the other, going back to that original graph, the other bubble, how and why citizens use different media sources. Again, back to that quote, that they premise their analysis on people's actual usage patterns. Some media are not really used primarily for information, and should they be weighted differently in this calculus than those that we use for information? There's a lot of communications folks are familiar with the uses and gratifications research that helps explain why people rely on different media. That could potentially have some useful findings that could be brought to bear on some of this. To what extent are different information sources substitutes? This became a fairly contentious issue in the media ownership proceeding, that there was some different ways of interpreting the research that was done. To what extent is television a substitute for radio, which is a substitute for newspapers? One could take a very broad and holistic type of approach and say information is information. Other folks argue that we need to adjust this with some real detailed knowledge of indeed how we use different information sources differently, that a radio news story is fundamentally different in many ways from a newspaper news story, or the context even in which we use different information sources reflect different needs that we're trying to fulfill. So again, obviously all of this muddies the waters a bit on assessing diversity, but like I said, these cans of worms have really been opened, and now I don't think you should just ignore them. And then finally into the effects issue, which I think it was interesting that this becomes something we might need to think about. Again, coming from what the FCC said, the differences in usage across media are in part reflections of the differential impact on the user of television, radio, newspapers, etc. So in theory, when the Commission weighted different technologies differently based on how we use them, that is, to what extent do we rely on them for news and public affairs, there was a presumption in there that was a reflection of the magnitude of their effect. Well, the effects literature, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is quite vast. And I think we would all like to see, if the Commission is really trying to get at that kind of issue, that it delve into that a bit more deeply than it did, and think about effects in a variety of ways. How do different media affect the public's agenda? Agenda-setting research seems to me particularly useful in this regard, in terms of how media may not help us decide what to think, but they may help us decide what issues are most important. Political participation, the relationship between usage of different media sources and political participation, and political knowledge, all these become potential tools. I'm not advocating these, but I'm saying these become potential tools that feed into a more robust process of weighting different sources differently when it comes to the question of assessing their diversity importance. Again, borrowing the Commission's language there. And then finally, to what extent do some media rely on other media? When it comes to weighting a television station versus a newspaper versus a radio station, etc., maybe we need to also consider the fact that sometimes it is the case that the newspaper in a market actually is the key driver of what the television stations or the newspapers in a market decide to cover. And those complex intermedia interactions perhaps need to be explored to be able to inform this weighting process a bit more thoroughly. To conclude then, there's obviously a broad range of questions that need to be brought to bear on the process of assessing diversity in a way that effectively informs ownership policy. And also, reflecting this kind of the presentation that I've given, that we need to draw upon, engage in a wider range of research areas than has traditionally characterized ownership policymaking, and that just naturally arises from the type of questions that are being asked now. A couple things that aren't here, but I just wanted to, I had the advantage of being able to listen to all the presentations today and had a couple other thoughts, going to the bigger picture of how some of these issues are framed. Ellie's where he talked about the Cassandras and the Pollyannas, I was thinking about that because it was so true that you have these two extremes with these particular arguments, and it's always been interesting to me that the Cassandra's argument is there are bad things that happen if we let concentration happen. The Pollyanna's argument is no, they're not. And if you think about it, that reflects, and the FCC's analytical framework is very similar, and that reflects a particular sense of where the burden of proof lies. And I think it's always been fascinating to me that on one side, one group is assigned the task of proving harm, and the other group, however, isn't assigned the task of proving benefit, just lack of harm. And I think that's been the nature of how this debate has been framed, and I always think that's because as a researcher, I'd love to see the research as well. I'm very interested in what are the potential benefits to the marketplace of ideas that might arise from greater concentration of ownership. But I think that there's always been this tilt to the analytical framework that's been brought to bear that reflects a burden of proof that doesn't ride right down the middle. And Ellie's talk today just had me thinking about that issue. And it also had me thinking about the other issue, which is when we do this sort of questioning of the state of affairs today, we do engage quite often in this process of historical analysis, which is how do things compare to, on one side, people talk about a golden age that's lost. On the other side, people talk about the fact that, well, the golden age wasn't really so golden. again, here, I'm often frustrated that in all the debate on the current state of affairs, that the analysis never focuses on, well, how does the current state of affairs compare in regard to the potential that currently exists? What if that was our analytical frame? Not how do things compare 10 years ago, because that's really an apples and oranges issue as our media environment changes so dramatically. But I would love it if the focus was always on how, for example, diverse are the range of sources in a particular market compared to how diverse they could be. And that, because that changes over time. And to what extent is the potential of a particular media system of a particular point in time being realized? And that pulls history out of it a little bit, not completely, of course, but I think these would be more constructive frames for us to use going forward. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, there are a few more questions I think that are being gathered, so why don't we go ahead with the first one here, and I'll wait for the rest to come in if they're coming. The first question is for Professor Napoli, and the question is, previous research has looked at credibility, both credibility of source and credibility of information, in the past in similar ways that you've looked at diversity. Can we go from research to application with these issues, or are they going to remain buried in academic journals? So I think the question is really asking, how can we sort of bring this more to the fore of public attention, these issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, and it's funny because this actually is part of what I've often using as a stump speech at academic conferences, which is those of you who are doing scholarly research who perhaps didn't traditionally think that there were policy applications for your work should think primarily in that way now. That is, a lot of, whether we're talking about agenda setting research or research on the effects between media usage and political participation, nobody typically designs and engages in that type of work, or traditionally hasn't at least, with the notion of what are the policy implications of my work. And so if we could start thinking that way, I think that would, I think it's important for scholars who don't traditionally think of themselves as policy scholars to think of themselves more as policy scholars than they have. So work on credibility, for example, could easily have been something else that could have factored into this process of assessing the diversity and importance of different sources. So it's up to I think it's up to scholars on the one hand. It's easy to go up there and lament, oh, no one ever listens to us academics, and to a certain degree that's true. And I can't claim to have any answer to how that how you overcome that. But I don't think it's quite as blanket a generalization as you could make either. I think it's about thinking about your work in a policy-specific context, and then actually doing the legwork to get it into hands of people other than some journal editor. And we're never trained to do a very good job of that. But to think about, I've got this study. Who out there, in the non-academic sector would be interested in what I have to say, and develop and cultivate those networks, which is, again, a whole bunch of legwork and grunt work that we're not rewarded for typically, and not encouraged to do, in some cases actually discouraged to do. But, so there has to come from the individual. But I think, somewhat of a culture change in academia wouldn't be bad either.
I'm going to combine two questions into one question for Dr. Harwood. The question is this: how do we get media firms to be just? That is, in your opinion, do we extort them, or do we regulate them directly? And part two of the question is, can you give us your favorite example of a just media firm and an unjust media firm?
Well, that's a big...
Extort, sorry, excuse me. I'm not sure how we would extort them. That's an interesting. That might be an interesting question in and of itself.
That's a big order. Thank you. An example of a just media firm. Well, I can think of a very successful media monopoly in a university town, Lawrence, Kansas, 45 miles from Kansas City, where everything's up to date. There, one family has devoted itself to constructing a media empire of a local sort, having internet, newspaper, television, radio, and Lord knows what else in one ownership. The family clearly does not seek to maximize profits, but it gets along very well. And we have at least anecdotal information from communication faculty there that the Kansas City Star has almost been driven out of the use of it, of many families in Lawrence because the local job is done so well. As for an unjust one, I think you could find abundant examples on your own, and I shall not tarry there. How do we get media firms to be just? Do we exhort them or regulate them? Okay. Do we ask them to do it on their own or compel them? Let me translate. And the answer is, please do not rush to regulate, because you're dealing with First Amendment entities. And any regulation, especially of a First Amendment entity, is likely to have unwanted consequences. Consequences we did not think of. Media firms have special protections because of what they do, as well as special obligations. So the first thing to do is to ask them to look at themselves. Bill Keller is a good example of a media mogul looking at himself. He's not an owner, but of course he's a chief employer. And I'm reminded that in his piece on Monday, in the Monday Times this week, in which he laid out some of the things the Times ought to be doing, alluded to by Connie, I believe, he listed, he didn't put it this way, but I shall, more work, more reporting, more emphasis on what might be called the land beyond the Hudson River. More work in perhaps what might be called the hinterlands of New York, but really the heart of the United States. That makes me feel a lot better because, of course, I'm a patsy for localism. Then, if that doesn't work, there are other means. There is social criticism, and bloggers provide plenty of that. There is the criticism of pressure groups, and I don't say that in a negative way, but in a straightforward political science way, of pressure groups. And as a last nuclear resort, official regulation backed by compulsion. But I do not recommend that.
Okay, the next question is for Dr. Napoli. It says, you raised over 20 questions but did not answer them because they are hard to operationalize for regulatory rules under the First Amendment. It kind of makes one have sympathy with the FCC staff that had to develop real standards rather than ask academic questions. So Phil, it says how, but I think it might mean what, would your own diversity measure look like today?
I'm working on it. That it would, because and that's the thing. It has to be. And Ellie didn't get a chance to talk about his today, but it has to be fairly simple so that they'll actually use it. And again, I didn't mean to imply that all that needs to be in there. What I was trying to illustrate was that as we go forward with this, there's a wide range of questions that perhaps policymakers need to explain why some of that stuff needs to get tossed out or just can't get fit into the calculus. My ideal, from a conceptual standpoint, has in it some ability to account for the variation in the extent to which how the individual outlets are performing reflects the goals that the FCC considers most important, things like diversity, localism, et cetera. So that it gets beyond. I'm not a big fan, of necessarily even using, for example, the HHI as a starting point for something like this, because ingrained in that is the notion that diversity is in and of itself a subset of the notion of competition. And I don't know, like I said, that really reflects the way policy analysis should go forward on something like this. So I don't have a diversity index yet to be able to put forth, as the answer. If I did, that would have been the focus of my talk. Needless to say.
Time for one more question? Okay, one more question. It was interesting to hear you talk about the FCC's sort of commitment, if you will, to these principles of diversity, competition, and localism. And this question is sort of looking at that in terms of the future, and the future of media. As we go digital to digital media, I think that there's a question about these very principles and whether they will endure into the future, because these principles of diversity, competition, and localism are all based on the scarcity rationale for broadcast media. There aren't enough, outlets for everyone to have a voice, and so therefore media firms operate as a public trustee and have to ensure that they can get diverse viewpoints out there, since only a few people can speak. So the question is, in your research, have you seen this as a real commitment beyond the media that we currently deal with, beyond traditional media, that is, as we go forth into the digital future, and we have digital delivery systems of pretty much all media? Do you have a feeling, based on what you've read of FCC documents and others working in the policy arena, that this really is an enduring commitment to these issues of diversity, competition, and localism, as sort of the bottom drops out of the very rationale for those concepts in the first place, as there is no more scarcity?
I guess I would say I don't know if I'd quite agree that scarcity is the bedrock of them. Because we've seen, for example, the diversity principle, localism principle applied to cable television. When we talk about ownership limits that have existed there, when we talk about the PEG requirements that lead to to cable systems having to offer community access to their networks. So it's issues of diversity have found their way into the open or forced access issue, however you choose to describe it, within the internet context. So I don't see them as closely tied to the scarcity issue as that. So that would be my take on that as well.
Okay. I want to thank each of our speakers and invite you to help me in showing our appreciation.